Russia has, for most of its history, struggled to keep up with the rest of the world's greatest powers. After decades, if not centuries, the lack of civil liberties, a struggling economy, and an obsolete military was bound to cause the empire to break under the threat of revolution. World War I was ultimately the straw that broke the camel's back. Due to shortages of food caused by the war, a protest of women soon turned into a full-scale revolution that resulted in the Romanov dynasty, whom had ruled Russia for over 300 years, being forced out of power. To the day when the peoples of Russia could elect a constitutional assembly, a new government would have to be formed to rule the empire for the time being. But whether they could hold everything together till that day came was yet to be seen. On the 27th of February, a few days into the revolution, the Duma, which was a somewhat democratically elected but weak type of parliament, created what they called the Temporary Committee of the State Duma, which was an attempt to fill the power vacuum left by the dwindling authority of Tsar Nicholas. They weren't the only ones with that idea. On the other side of the Tau-Red Palace, the members of socialist parties, along with many regular workers and soldiers, elected their own parliament called the Petrograd Soviet. Cut to a few days, and Nicholas was detained in Pskov by members of the military who urged him to step down, which he ultimately did. Initially, he was going to pass the crown to his son, Alexeyevich, but decided not to, believing that this would separate him from his family. So, his brother Mihuel was offered the crown, but he himself refused because the members of the new government couldn't promise his safety. With that, 300 years of Romanov rule faded away into a new era that was believed to harbor a better future. One of the first things that the Provisional Government did was loosen all restrictions of freedom of speech, allowing people from all over Russia to speak their minds, literally in the middle of the streets. Unfortunately for them, this also meant that people could voice their grievances against them. As mentioned, the members of the Provisional Government were made up of members of the State Duma, such as Pavel Milyukov, Alexander Kerensky, and Prince Love, the latter being the new head of state. These men had essentially given themselves positions of power without the vote of the people responsible for the revolution. Pavel Milyukov was even confronted by a worker for this, saying, quote, "And to you, by who have you been chosen?" Milyukov responded by saying, "We have been chosen by the Russian Revolution." Sounds pretty cool, but unfortunately for Milyukov, this wasn't true. Throughout the entirety of his existence, the Provisional Government only had power on paper in an almost lawless society. Without the support of the masses, it was only a matter of time before they lost control. Unlike the Duma, the Petrograd Soviet did not face such an issue. The Petrograd Soviet, along with all of those in other cities, were comprised of various leftist factions, workers, peasants, and soldiers that were usually elected by factories or army units. While these elections weren't always perfect, it still gave them more legitimacy than the Duma. On one hand, you had the Provisional Government, which had power, but no means to exert it, and on the other you had the Soviets, who had the blessing of the masses. The relationship between these two organizations wasn't always antagonistic, at least at the beginning when the Soviets were controlled by some more moderate socialists, such as the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries of the right. Instead of competing for power, the Petrograd Soviet took on a role of guidance to keep the Provisional Government in line, ensuring the protection of what they called revolutionary democracy, and to assure Russia's transition from what they believed was the bourgeoisie phase to the socialist phase. Considering most of the members of the Provisional Government were either progressive or moderate conservatives of the Constitutional Democratic Party led by Pavel Milyukov, there was bound to be conflict. There was plenty of communication between the two, largely thanks to Alexander Kerensky, whom was a member of both. Kerensky was one of the heroes of the February Revolution, playing an important role in forming the new government, and for his participation early on in the Petrograd Soviet. On the 2nd of March, 1917, right after becoming the new Minister of Justice, he gave a speech to the Petrograd Soviet. "Comrades, do you not have faith in me? I speak from the bottom of my soul, from the bottom of my heart. If you don't have faith in me, then I am willing to die, right here in front of your eyes." With his popularity at an all-time high, the crowd responded with a thunderous applause. Outside of Petrograd, the February Revolution spread across Russia over the course of a few days, with the regions starting their own local revolutions. The power dynamics outside of the capital were usually quite different. To start, the liberal and the socialist intelligentsia often worked together in the same democratic institutions. Some towns and provinces even declared their own independence from Petrograd, even approving of their own laws in rejection to those of the capital. In the countryside, the peasants were initially hesitant to support the revolution due to fears that it would be short-lived, but once they realized that Tsar Nicholas was not coming back, their attitudes soon changed. The mini revolutions of the countryside saw the peasants take great initiative in securing their demands. Land, tools, livestock, and other such things were requisitioned by peasant communities from the old landlords and small private farms, sometimes peacefully and other times violently. The fact that the peasants organized themselves to fulfill their own wishes is more than enough evidence to debunk the claim that they were all servile and easily manipulated. The minority groups of the Russian Empire viewed the revolution as a chance to further their national interests, such as an increased political and cultural autonomy, and, later on, even independence. All over the empire, nationalist groups of leftist ideologies took power in their respective nations, such as the Ukrainian Rada. You also had non-leftist governments, such as the Finnish parliament, which would go on to fight a brief civil war against the local Soviets. In wake of the February Revolution, the Russian Empire had essentially balkanized into a free-for-all between various regions, cities, and villages, all with different agendas. Preventing the state from falling into complete anarchy was a gargantuan task that, as we will see, the Provisional Government was ill-suited for. Initially, the first days of the Provisional Government were rather successful. People were granted freedom of expression and freedom of the press, and laws that enforced discrimination based on race, religion, and social class were eliminated. A general amnesty was given, the death penalty was abolished, the police became responsible to the local government, and the courts and penal system were revised. Democratic organisms of local government were established, all adult men were given the right to vote, and preparations for a constitutional assembly were being made. Prince Love even conceded the right to vote for women after he conversed with a group of suffragettes. While these changes helped Russian society develop a culture of democracy, it didn't get rid of their more sinister desires. Many people, particularly of the lower classes, such as the peasants and the workers, viewed the revolution as an opportunity for revenge against the former elites for centuries of oppression. Lynchings, theft, and murder would become ever so common as the months went on. One of the main issues facing revolutionary Russia was the ongoing slaughter of World War I. The war had claimed millions of casualties, and its economic consequences caused a shortage of food and other basic necessities. Morale, both on and behind the front, was incredibly low, and desertion was a common sight. If the war wasn't bad enough, the troops had to deal with constant abuse from many of their commanding officers. Officers had the authority to beat and even kill their men for the slightest screw-ups. After the revolution, however, this would drastically change. One of the first orders given by the Petrograd Soviet was Order No. 1, which eroded the authority of all army officers. On one hand, it gave the soldiers some much-needed dignity, but on the other, it destroyed all discipline within the military, severely weakening Russia's ability to fight. Lov, Miluikov, Kerensky, and basically everyone else in the Provisional Government were in favor of continuing the war. Those in the Petrograd Soviet were also in favor, officially adopting, on March 21st, a policy of revolutionary definism, which called for the defense of Russia and a campaign for international peace without annexations or compensations. As expected, this decision was very unpopular amongst the troops who just wanted to go back home, especially the peasants who didn't want to miss out on the redistribution of land. On March 27th, the Provisional Government gave their official statement on Russia's war objectives, which mostly aligned with what the Soviets had said previously. However, in an interview with the Manchester Guardian, Pavel Miluikov said that he wouldn't alter Russia's commitment to the Allies, which caused some backlash from both the liberals and the socialists. While the Soviets' peace plan was ultimately ratified, people still remained discontent. On the 20th of April, thousands of armed workers and soldiers took to the Petrograd streets to protest for the dismissal of the 10 bourgeoisie ministers, the end of the war, and the establishment of a new revolutionary government. The mass had formed headed towards the Mariinsky Palace in hopes of convincing the Soviets to take power. Some of them even surrounded Miluikov's car and began banging on it. However, the Soviets refused to support them, and even went out as far as to help the Provisional Government restore order. Still frustrated, the protesters continued their demonstration and clashed on Nevsky Avenue against right-wing and monarchist counter-protesters. During the violence, many people would lose their lives. The threat of civil war began to loom over Russia, and, in an attempt to prevent it, the leaders of the Soviets began to join in a government to strengthen its authority. One of the Soviets' most prominent leaders was the Georgian Menshevik Irakli Tsereteli, who was considered by Prince Love to be the only true statesman. placing a greater emphasis on the needs of the state over those of classes and political parties. Love needed members of the Soviets to join his government to help give it more authority, but doing so was made difficult by having Milyukov in his cabinet. But after the demission of the cadet Guchov, one of Milyukov's closest allies, Love finally dismissed him. A new cabinet was formed with Chernov, Kerensky, Skobelev, and Tseretelli. Despite this coalition being aimed at reinforcing the Russian Democratic Center, it had the opposite effect. Many of Milyukov's cadets stood with him and joined the right-wing opposition against the government. Meanwhile, on the left, many radical socialists had already, or were about to, come back home from exile and slowly take charge of the Soviets. On the 3rd of April, the exiled Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia after living in exile in Switzerland. To reach his destination, he had to travel first through Germany. The Germans believed that by helping Russian revolutionaries, they could destabilize their enemy and knock them out of the war. The Germans would also provide Lenin and his Bolsheviks with financial support that would give them an edge over their opponents. When he arrived in Petrograd, Lenin was greeted by a crowd of cheering supporters and an army band. After giving a speech, he bunkered down in the Bolshevik headquarters at the Sheshinskaya Palace for the rest of the day. On the 4th, he finally made his first appearance in the Petrograd Soviet. When there, he introduced what he called the April Theses and claimed that a bourgeoisie democracy and a democratic parliament was not necessary, being nothing more than a setback. Instead, they should start a new revolution to transfer power to a proletariat government made up of the workers, soldiers, and peasants. Instead of a thunderous applause, the members of the Soviet became furious with the audacity that Lenin had to make such a speech. Considering that the majority of them, including many Bolsheviks, were against this, it seemed like Lenin had no hope at accomplishing anything. Not wanting to back out, the Provisional Government came up with a plan to end the War with Germany under favorable conditions. The Russians were to launch an offensive on two fronts, first being the literal front and the second being a political one. The Soviets were tasked with uniting a Congress of International Socialists from the warring nations to negotiate a peace deal for everyone. The Provisional Government was to convince the Western Allies to revise their war aims, as they couldn't make a peace deal if they had demands against the enemy. Unfortunately for the Russians, their attempts on the political front were a failure. The conference that the Socialists wanted to organize in Stockholm never came to be, as the Allies prohibited their citizens from attending by denying passports. They also refused to revise their war aims. The only other option the Russians had would be to defeat the Central Powers on the front line. While supply issues had been somewhat resolved, the discipline within the army was almost impossible to enforce due to Order No. 1, and morale was at an all-time low. If they wanted the offensive to succeed, they need to give the troops something to fight for. Political commissars were dispatched to the front in an attempt to rally the soldiers for the offensive. On the 11th of May, Kerensky announced the Declaration of Rights of Soldiers, which was meant to restore the authority of officers on the front. To accompany all of this, Kerensky went on a tour of the front line to give speeches. At one point in his life, Kerensky aspired to be an actor. While this never came to fruition, he undoubtedly put what he had learnt to practice. He spoke with a strident voice and was constantly moving until he would eventually pass out from exhaustion. This theatrical performance was enough to bring hardened war veterans to tears as he asked them to make the ultimate sacrifice for their country. However, the reactions from the audience were by no means representative of the army as a whole. Most of the attendees were officers, intelligentsia, and members of soldiers' committees. While an ordinary peasant soldier may be initially hooked, that would soon change after returning to the trenches. Kerensky wasn't the only one who had the idea of going to the front. Many more agitators from the Socialist Revolutionaries of the left and the Bolsheviks integrated themselves in the army and gave their own speeches about how this offensive was against the best interests of the workers and the soldiers. For the tired soldiers who just wanted to go home, these agitators sounded quite convincing. Back in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks and the anarchists were even trying to organize a protest, but the Soviets put a stop to that on the 9th of June. After the February Revolution, General Brusilov was appointed head of the army. Not only was Brusilov one of Russia's best commanders at the time, but he was also supportive of democracy and the creation of soldiers' committees. However, this also created some friction between him and other generals. Regardless, he was still Russia's best hope at ending the war. Galicia was chosen as a site for the attack. One of the main reasons for this was because the units in this area were less affected by the revolution, even continuing to salute their officers, but the reserves that had been brought up from the rear were considered much less reliable. The Provisional Government was essentially betting everything on this offensive, causing many of its members to feel worried with the stakes at hand. Earlier in May, Tsereteli said in front of the Petrograd Soviet, quote, "What kind of impression will we give the peoples of the world if a catastrophe on the front were to follow our call? The governments of other countries will say to their people, while pointing at us, they urge you to follow their example, and that is what it leads to. It would mean our destruction, as that of your own." The offensive began on the 16th of June, opening with the largest artillery barrage that the Russian army had ever conducted till that point. 2 days later, the Russian assault battalions occupied what was left of the enemy's trenches. Initially, the offensive seemed to be going well, so much so that the press proudly announced to the public that it was a success. But after 2 days of advancing, most of the troops stopped and headed back to their trenches after the Germans counterattacked. There were, however, a few exceptions. The divisions under General Kornilov managed to capture the cities of Galich and Kalush. Granted, his troops did begin raping, looting, and murdering the local inhabitants, but still, this event did give Kornilov some fame. Before the whole thing fell apart, the Petrograd Soviet organized a demonstration to rally support for their policy of revolutionary definitism and the coalition with the liberals. To their surprise, the 500,000 people that went out to demonstrate were protesting the exact opposite, as the Bolsheviks, social revolutionaries of the left, and the anarchists had hijacked the event. The demonstrators carried with them signs that said, "All power to the Soviets," and other phrases against the war. The whole ordeal was a crippling blow to the moderates. As the days went on, the offensive came to a stop. The Army High Command wanted to reinforce the front with units from Petrograd. The 1st Machine Gun Regiment, which was a Bolshevik stronghold, received the order to send 500 of their machine guns and crews to the front. Obviously, they didn't want to, and on the 21st, approved a resolution stating that they would only go to fight a revolutionary war. Basically, this meant that they wanted a government with no capitalists, though they were later convinced to go after 2 days. The Kerensky offensive was a complete disaster. All it managed to do was destroy any faith that the masses had in the government and push the troops closer to mutiny. The brief episode of street violence and disobedience was served as a prologue for what's to come. On the 7th of July, Prince Lvov resigned as head of the Provisional Government and was replaced with Kerensky. A few days before, several cadets also resigned from their positions over disagreements regarding Ukraine. After the revolution, Ukraine was initially given a greater level of autonomy, but soon its leaders, such as Simon Petlera, were to declare full independence from Russia. Kerensky and Tsereteli were sent to negotiate with the Ukrainians, offering to give them certain concessions. But this move only offended many in the Constitutional Democratic Party. So on top of fighting the Central Powers, both the far right and the far left, the Provisional Government was now close to ripping itself apart. Back to the Central Powers, they were in the process of launching their own offensive against the Russians. On the 6th of July, a German assault force broke through in southern Ukraine and in the Baltics. Many within the army and public put a lot of the blame on Kerensky, as he had taken a major role in the planning of the failed offensive. To quote one disappointed citizen, "It's a horrible feeling, finding out that your favorite idol has a feet of clay and is falling apart. I had a blind faith in Kerensky, but now he's just committing mistake after mistake." With the Germans being so close to Petrograd, things in the capital only got more tense. Now, being a hardcore revolutionary leader is rather exhausting, so on June 29th, Lenin headed to Finland for a rare vacation right before shit was about to hit the fan. The soldiers of the previously mentioned 1st Machine Gun Regiment held an armed protest on the 3rd of July. Notably, figures such as Leon Trotsky, who was not yet a Bolshevik, gave speeches at these demonstrations in favor of transferring power to the Soviets. That night, the men couldn't sleep and debated on whether or not they should join the uprising. They formed a revolutionary committee that was joined by low-ranking Bolsheviks and sent emissaries to factories, Kronstadt, and to other units to join them. The following day, a mass of workers and soldiers took to the streets. The Bolsheviks and anarchists that tried to lead the demonstration failed to set any specific objectives. The whole ordeal turned into an orgy of theft and violence, with soldiers firing their weapons in the air and to anyone they didn't like. The Black Hundreds, a far-right monarchist group, even engaged in the violence by getting into shootouts with the soldiers. At sunset, a mob that had formed outside of the Tauride Palace where the Petrograd Soviet had gathered. They shouted, "All power to the Soviets," while the guys inside debated the formation of a socialist government after the failure of the coalition. Despite being in the minority, the Bolsheviks of the Soviet formed a special commission to help organize the mass outside, though little came of this. The Central Committee of the Bolsheviks gathered in the Sheshinskaya Palace to discuss the protest. Not wanting to risk everything on a premature coup, the committee took a moderate approach to the situation. However, the Bolshevik leaders had very little control of the situation on the ground. Petrograd was almost entirely under the control of the workers and the soldiers, who were willing to continue the protest the next day. In the morning, shops were closed and the streets were empty. Before noon, the city center was flooded with people. They were also joined by 20,000 sailors from Kronstadt, armed with revolvers and rifles, who took positions at the Nikolaevsky Bridge. Interestingly, the sailors seemed to be treating this whole situation as a little vacation in the city, with many of them strolling around with their girlfriends. Other demonstrators took things a lot more seriously. Back at the Tauride Palace, a mob had detained Viktor Chernov, one of the leaders of the Socialist Revolutionaries. Frustrated, a worker went up to him and said, quote, "Son of a bitch, just take power when it's offered to you." Leon Trotski had to intervene on behalf of Chernov, freeing him from the mob. The protests eventually dissolved between the night of the 4th and the 5th, the main reason for this being that there were news of loyal troops of the government approaching Petrograd, and because the demonstration lacked proper leadership. After missing out of all the fun, Lenin finally returned to Petrograd. He was rather skeptical of the protest and wasn't willing to take leadership just yet. When a crowd had gathered outside of the Bolshevik headquarters, Lenin greeted them from the balcony while telling them not to take power. Another reason that ended the protest was the revelation of documents detailing Bolshevik ties to the Germans, resulted in many people turning on Lenin and his buddies. Loyalist troops from the Ismailovsky Regiment turned on the Bolsheviks and helped restore order to the capital. Army cadets sacked the office of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, while many other newspapers called the Bolsheviks traitors. About 800 Bolsheviks were detained, including Kamenev, Lunacharsky, Koyontai, and associates such as Trotski. Lenin managed to escape to Petrograd and fled the Finland with Zinoviev, as the Provisional Government accused him of high treason. While many people at the time and contemporary historians have claimed that the Bolsheviks were German agents, it isn't entirely true. Despite Lenin receiving funding from Berlin, there is no evidence that the Bolsheviks intentionally planned their policy to align with that of Berlin. Regardless, they are still considered cunts by many, which is why some historians claim that the Days of July was a failed Bolshevik coup. Is that true? In short, no. According to Trotsky, for what little that's worth, these accusations were meant to slander them, and that the Bolsheviks believed that the conditions for a coup were not met. He then references the Paris Commune and how it failed because it lacked support from the rest of the country. You also have to look at how the Bolshevik leadership acted. There are two things that you should know about Vladimir Lenin, and that is that he was a chronic worker and a wannabe dictator. Going on vacation while letting his subordinates plan a seizure of power is something that Lenin simply wouldn't do. He'd have been working non-stop and bossing people around if this was actually supposed to be a coup. I think the historian Rex A. Wade summarizes the whole situation quite well. They were a genuine outbreak of popular discontent and a vindication of more radical and effective government, a monochrome socialist government that could make popular aspirations for peace, economic reforms, and solutions to the many problems that plagued the country. The Bolsheviks were the main party that supported these demands, and their harsh criticism of the government helped focus the discontent of the workers and soldiers on the demand for Soviet power as a solution to their problems. After the failure of Russia's summer offensive, General Brusilov was replaced by General Kornilov, who we've previously discussed as having a decent reputation. Unlike other generals of noble and aristocratic origins, Kornilov was born to a Cossack father and a Buryat mother in Siberia. His early military career was spent in Central Asia, where he learned the local languages and formed a personal bodyguard unit of Turkish soldiers. During the months of the Provisional Government, Kornilov maintained a hostile relationship with the Soviets, butting heads with them after they refused to let him quell civil unrest. When given command of the army, he began making demands towards Kerensky, mostly in regards to military issues such as making the death penalty applicable in the rear, abolishing the soldiers' committees, and dispersing revolutionary regiments. However, he soon extended these demands elsewhere, wanting to instill martial law, militarizing the railways and industries. Basically, he wanted a military dictatorship to save Russia. Knowing all this, it's a surprise that Kerensky would ever want a guy like Kornilov. But when you consider what was arguably Kerensky's biggest threat, it all starts to make sense. Even after being outed for their connections with the Germans, the Bolshevik Party quickly made a comeback as the Provisional Government failed to bring an end to the war and solve the country's economic situation. In a desperate attempt to unite the nation around him, Kerensky held a conference in the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. However, Kornilov essentially stole the spotlight from him. When he arrived, he was greeted by an excited crowd of middle and upper-class Russians who covered him in flowers and carried him to his car. When the conference was held, the attendees were basically divided into two groups. On the right, you had what could be called the bourgeoisie, industrialists, etc., and on the left, you had the workers, soldiers, socialists, and so on, both of which hated Kerensky. Overall, the whole thing was a pathetic last attempt to save the situation. Kerensky's closing speech was nothing to admire, lasting longer than needed and being an incoherent mess. The end result of all this was that the democratic intelligentsia lost all faith in him. During the month of August, the press began warning the public of an imminent Bolshevik coup, which in reality wasn't true. But the fear of this fictional coup and the need to re-establish the government's authority ultimately brought these two very different men together against a common enemy. By the end of August, Kornilov sent several units loyal to him to Petrograd, one being the so-called Wild Division, which was made up of troops from the Caucasus. While it didn't mean that he had any intentions to overthrow the government, it did concern some people. What followed next can only be described as a screw-up of tremendous proportions. You know how when your parents aren't getting along, so they get you to relay information between them, but you accidentally explain things incorrectly, causing a fight? Something like that happened between Kornilov and Kerensky. And Love, a member of the 4th Duma, was acting as an intermediary between Kornilov and Kerensky. On the 24th of August, Love presented himself as an emissary of Kerensky to Kornilov and presented him with three options to strengthen the government. The first was to give Kerensky dictatorial powers, the second was a joint dictatorship between the two of them, and the third was to make Kornilov a dictator with Kerensky as a minister. Since he believed that these options were legitimate, Kornilov chose the third. On the 26th, Love then returned to Kerensky and told him that Kornilov was demanding dictatorial powers and that he wanted to discuss this with him and Mogilev. Without a second thought, Kerensky determined that Kornilov was attempting a coup. He then called Kornilov, but instead of trying to paint a clear picture, he just asked him to confirm what he said without much specification. Kornilov, being oblivious, just said yes, sealing his fate. Kerensky then exposed this counter-revolutionary plot to his cabinet, hoping to rally the nation against the threat. But not everyone believed this plot. Boris Savinkov, former revolutionary terrorist turned statesman, realized that this was just a misunderstanding and urged Kerensky to clear things up with Kornilov, but he refused. Many of his ministers resigned after realizing that it was too late for reconciliation. When Kornilov received a telegram stating that he was basically fired, he didn't believe it, thinking that Kerensky had been captured and forced to sign it by the Bolsheviks. He then ordered General Krimov to advance on the capital and instill martial law, believing that the Provisional Government needed saving. Despite there being some attempts to clear the situation, Kerensky ultimately labeled Kornilov as a traitor to the revolution. Kornilov, being the proud Russian patriot that he was, took issue with this and gave a statement to the commanders on the front that this whole thing was a provocation and that the government had fallen to the Bolsheviks and the Germans. With thousands of soldiers on the way to occupy the capital, the Petrograd Soviet formed a special committee with members from all major parties, including people like Trotski, who had been freed from prison. Not having much choice, the Soviet had to rely on the military committee of the Bolsheviks to mobilize enough workers and soldiers for the defense of Petrograd. Many regiments, workers, militias, and sailors took their own initiative to prepare for the fight, and the Syndicate for Rail Workers blocked the lines to slow down General Krimov. Several of them even contacted Krimov's troops and urged them to stop their advance. After his train was stopped and his soldiers disarmed, Krimov was allowed to travel to Petrograd to speak with members of the government. Once there, he explained to Kerensky that he was only trying to defend the government. However, he was told by him that he would be tried by a military court for this perceived treason. However, Krimov took his own life before that could happen. The revolt finally came to an end on the 1st of September, when Kornilov was arrested and imprisoned in the Baikov Monastery for the foreseeable future. Despite overcoming the situation, Kerensky ruined his reputation with the political right and other generals after imprisoning their hero, while the left viewed this as a feud between two wannabe Napoleons. The enlisted men also believed that most of their officers were involved or were sympathetic with Kornilov, resulting in more desertions, the execution of officers, and the insistence on giving all power to the Soviets. With the threat of a Bolshevik takeover and the complete lack of faith in the state, Whether the Provisional Government could hold out long enough for the elections of the Constitutional Assembly was yet to be seen. To step away from Petrograd, the situation in the country was an absolute mess. Due to the shortage of food within the cities, many of their desperate residents had little choice to search for food in the countryside. Individuals referred to as sackmen, due to the sacks they carried, who would have guessed, crammed onto the very few trains that they could find and traveled to rural areas with excess grain. Most of them brought with them items to trade with the peasants, but there were also many who stole grain at gunpoint. Soldiers who had deserted with their weapons went on the hunt for food, sometimes forming gangs and even robbing trains. The land acquisitions by the peasants became increasingly more violent. Due to the Provisional Government's refusal to conduct a land reform, the peasants grew tired of waiting. With the arrival of armed deserters, they began to seize land by force. This new wave of the land war seemingly started with the murder of Boris Vyazemsky, who had punished the local communities after the 1905 revolution. On the 24th of August, his farm was surrounded by a mob who then got drunk off of his stash of vodka. After fighting off a unit of Cossacks, they arrested and tried Vyazemsky, wanting to send him to the front lines as punishment. However, he was soon lynched by a mob and killed. Crime and violence were on a constant rise throughout Russia. Murder and theft became ever so common. Sometimes people dressed as soldiers or police would claim to be robbing you under official business. Since the police were so overwhelmed, the rule of law was almost non-existent. Mobs of frustrated people would take matters into their own hands by lynching suspected criminals. But this arbitrary justice was far from perfect, and many innocent people were killed because of it. Worst of all for the Provisional Government, radical leftist groups such as the Bolsheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries of the left started to take over the Soviets. In Petrograd, the Bolsheviks had for the first time gained a majority in the Soviet after the 31st of August. On top of that, the soldiers and Red Guardsmen loyal to them had been armed after the Kornilov affair. Protests, strikes, banditry, separatism, and social and economic disintegration signaled the failure of the Provisional Government to guide Russia to a new beginning. As we all know, the Bolsheviks, with help from the Socialist Revolutionaries of the left, launched what was essentially a coup to overthrow the Kerensky government. Kerensky had been hoping they'd try something to give him an excuse to finally get rid of them. Unfortunately for him, he had severely overestimated his own strength. The most remarkable thing about the October Revolution, at least in Petrograd, was that very few people came to the defense of the Provisional Government. Some may claim that this is just typical apathetic Russian behavior, but if your country has ever gone through a revolution or something similar, then you'll know that this type of stuff is simply exhausting. Years of war and revolution had worn them down. Besides, why on earth would you fight for a government that you don't even like? Once the Bolsheviks took power, the former members of the Provisional Government were either imprisoned, executed, or fled, like what happened with Kerensky. While it was never truly democratic, the Provisional Government did lay down the groundwork for a democracy by granting civil liberties and preparing for the election of a constitutional assembly. Despite the election being held, the assembly was soon shut down by the Bolsheviks as it went against their interest. They basically killed Russian democracy before it truly got a chance to get off the ground. Perhaps if things were done differently, the revolution could have headed in a less violent and more democratic direction. Perhaps the Russians could try a second time, well, more like third, at breaking their long history of autocracy.
У нас нехватка боеприпасов 70%! Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?